3 years before Rosalie Hartwell ever stepped through the doors of Ravenshire Manor, the scandal had already become one of England's favorite stories. It began on a rain-soaked spring morning when Lady Vivienne Ravenshire vanished. She did not disappear into tragedy. She did not die. She did not leave behind a letter filled with grief or apology. She simply walked away. By sunset, half of London knew she had fled with a wealthy foreign nobleman whose handsome smile and extravagant promises had turned heads in every ballroom he entered. By the following week, every newspaper in England carried some version of the same story. The beautiful Duchess had abandoned her husband. The beautiful Duchess had abandoned her children. The beautiful Duchess had chosen another man. For most families, such humiliation would have faded with time. For the Ravenshires, it became a wound that never stopped bleeding. Duke Alistair Ravenshire stood through the storm of public ridicule with the same rigid dignity that had made him respected throughout the kingdom. He attended Parliament when duty required it. He managed his vast estates. He paid his workers fairly. He fulfilled every obligation expected of a duke. Yet the whispers followed him everywhere. Sometimes they came from behind jeweled fans. Sometimes from men pretending to offer sympathy. Sometimes from newspapers eager for another cruel headline. Even his wife could not love him. The words spread like poison through drawing rooms and banquet halls. Alistair never answered them. He simply became quieter. The years seemed to carve shadows beneath his eyes. His laughter vanished entirely. The warmth that had once made servants loyal and tenants devoted retreated behind walls of restraint and silence. People began calling him cold. The truth was far sadder. He was tired. Tired of defending himself. Tired of watching strangers discuss his pain as entertainment. Most of all, tired of seeing the cost paid by his children. Edward Ravenshire was only 10 when his mother left. At 13, he already carried himself like a man preparing for battle. He watched every room before entering it. He walked slightly ahead of his younger siblings in crowded places. He had learned that cruel words often arrived without warning. Whenever Clara reached for his hand, he gave it instantly. Whenever Henry looked uncertain, Edward moved closer. He had become a shield because nobody else could protect them from the world. Henry suffered differently. The 10-year-old rarely spoke about his mother. Instead, he folded his feelings inward until they became invisible. He spent hours staring through windows. He read books he barely understood. He smiled when people expected him to smile. Then he sat awake at night wondering why someone could stop loving her children. No answer ever came. The deepest wound belonged to little Clara. At 5 years old, most of her memories existed as fragments. A scent, a laugh, a glimpse of golden hair. She remembered almost nothing about her mother, yet somehow missed her constantly. Children rarely mourn what they have lost. They mourn what they never had. That made Clara's loneliness impossible to heal. The worst moment came during a grand London ball held in the middle of winter. Alistair had hoped a public appearance might help restore some normalcy to his children's lives. Instead, it reminded him how cruel society could be. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers. Music drifted through the air. Nobles laughed behind sparkling glasses of champagne. For a brief time, the children appeared happy. Then Clara wandered too close to a circle of aristocratic women. One of them recognized her. The woman smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Well," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "there's the youngest Ravenshire." Several women laughed softly. Another shook her head with theatrical pity. The first woman leaned closer. "Be careful, children." The room seemed to pause. Mothers tend to leave the Ravenshire family. The laughter that followed was quiet. That somehow made it worse. Clara stood frozen. Her small hands tightened around her dress. The women turned away almost immediately, already bored with the damage they had done. To them it had been a joke. To Clara it became a question she could not escape. She remained silent throughout the journey home. That night, long after the castle had fallen asleep, Alistair passed her bedroom and noticed light beneath the door. He entered quietly. Clara sat beneath her blankets with tears streaming down her face. The sight struck him harder than any insult ever had. She looked so small, so helpless, so determined not to cry loudly enough for anyone to hear. When she finally noticed him, her voice trembled. "Papa?" He crossed the room immediately. She climbed into his arms. For several moments neither spoke. Then came the question. Simple, gentle, devastating. "Was I not good enough for Mama to stay?" The Duke felt his heart break. Not crack, not ache, break, because there was no answer worthy of a child. He held her until exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep. Long afterward, he remained beside her bed staring into darkness. For the first time since Vivienne's betrayal, he stopped thinking about his own humiliation. He stopped caring about newspapers. He stopped caring about gossip. Only one truth mattered. His children were suffering, and he was failing to help them. The next morning, the aging housekeeper approached him with unusual hesitation. "The children barely eat anymore, Your Grace," she said gently. "Perhaps what this house needs is not another servant." Alistair looked up. "What does it need?" The old woman smiled faintly. "Someone who remembers that meals are meant to comfort, not simply feed." A week later, a carriage rolled through the iron gates of Ravenshire Manor carrying a young woman from a ruined but respectable family. As the wheels crunched across the frozen gravel, nobody inside the castle realized that the stranger approaching the front entrance would change the fate of every Ravenshire beneath that roof. Rosalie Hartwell arrived at Ravenshire Manor on a gray January morning beneath a sky the color of cold steel. The castle rose from the winter landscape like something carved from history itself. Snow clung to the ancient stone walls. Frost glittered across the iron gates. Tall windows reflected the pale daylight without warmth. For a moment she simply stood beside her trunk and stared. It was beautiful, and unbearably lonely. She had worked in noble households before. She knew the sounds of thriving estates. Laughter carried through corridors. Servants exchanged gossip in kitchens. Children ran where they were forbidden to run. Ravenshire Manor felt different. The silence seemed deliberate, as though happiness itself had been dismissed years ago. The head housekeeper led her through endless corridors before finally reaching the enormous kitchen at the heart of the estate. The room should have felt alive. Instead it felt abandoned despite being full of people. Servants moved efficiently without speaking much. Meals were prepared with precision but little enthusiasm. Even the fires seemed reluctant to burn. Rosalie sensed sadness immediately. Not the sharp grief of a recent tragedy. The slower sorrow that settled into walls after years of disappointment. By midday she had already noticed something unusual. The children's meals returned almost untouched. Perfectly cooked food disappeared into the dining room and reappeared barely disturbed. No one seemed surprised. The servants simply cleared the plates and continued working. Rosalie watched the pattern repeat for 3 days. On the 4th day she decided to find out why. That evening she remained near the dining room after supper. When the family rose from the table, she quietly entered to inspect what had been left behind. Edward's plate contained enough food for a full meal. Henry's looked much the same. Only Clara had attempted to eat, though even she had finished very little. Rosalie frowned. Children did not simply stop eating. Something else was happening. The answer arrived the next afternoon. She was carrying a basket of vegetables through a side corridor when she noticed Edward slipping something into his coat pocket. The movement was quick, practiced. Rosalie followed discreetly. A few minutes later she discovered him in a quiet sitting room beside Clara. The 13-year-old removed pieces of bread from his pocket and handed them to his sister. Clara accepted them eagerly. Rosalie understood immediately. The children were not refusing food. They simply hated eating in the dining room. Before either child noticed her, she quietly retreated. That evening she found Henry sitting alone near the kitchens. A napkin rested in his lap. Inside it lay slices of roasted meat from supper. He looked mortified when she saw them. Rosalie sat beside him. "I assume you plan to feed an army." Henry stared at the floor. "I wasn't hungry." She smiled gently. "That would be more convincing if you weren't hiding enough food for 3 people. The boy looked miserable. For several moments neither spoke. Then he whispered the truth. "The dining room feels empty." Rosalie felt her heart tighten. She finally understood. The problem was not the food. It was the loneliness served beside it. The following morning she changed everything. Instead of preparing another formal breakfast, she baked warm cinnamon bread before dawn. The smell drifted through the manor long before anyone reached the kitchen. Clara arrived first. The little girl appeared in the doorway wearing a nightgown and curiosity. Rosalie handed her a small piece. Clara smiled after the first bite. It was the brightest expression Rosalie had seen since arriving. Henry came next. Edward arrived last. Pretending he had no interest in any of it. Rosalie invited them to help knead dough. Edward immediately refused. Henry hesitated. Clara climbed onto a stool before anyone finished speaking. Within minutes flour covered her sleeves. The sight finally earned a laugh from Henry. The sound startled him. As though he had forgotten he was capable of making it. Rosalie pretended not to notice. The next morning the children returned. and the morning after that. Soon the kitchen became their refuge. They learned to roll dough, shape pastries, stir soup, measure ingredients. Mistakes became jokes rather than failures. One afternoon Henry accidentally launched flour across the room. Clara retaliated instantly. Edward attempted to remain dignified for nearly 30 seconds. Then he joined the battle. The kitchen erupted into chaos. White clouds filled the air. Servants laughed openly. Clara shrieked with delight. Rosalie found herself laughing so hard she could barely breathe. For the first time in years, Ravenshire Manor sounded like a home. The transformation spread beyond the kitchen. Henry spoke more often. Clara smiled more easily. Even Edward's constant vigilance began to soften. One evening Rosalie discovered him repairing Clara's broken toy horse. "You take care of everyone," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Someone has to." The words belonged to a child. The weariness behind them belonged to a man. Rosalie sat beside him. "You are allowed to be 13 sometimes." Edward stared at the toy. No one had ever told him that before. Something vulnerable flickered across his face before disappearing. From that night forward he trusted her. The person most unsettled by these changes was Duke Alistair Ravenshire. At first he simply noticed the laughter. Then he noticed his children voluntarily leaving their rooms. Then he noticed Clara speaking constantly about the kitchen. Every improvement seemed connected to one person, Miss Rosalie Hartwell. One rainy afternoon he finally witnessed it himself. Clara stood beside the stove while Rosalie prepared stew. Henry rolled pastry nearby. Edward argued about seasoning as though it were a matter of national importance. The scene looked absurdly ordinary, and therefore miraculous. Then disaster struck. Clara slipped. A large pot of boiling stew lurched dangerously toward her. Everything happened in seconds. Rosalie moved first. She grabbed the iron handle and dragged the pot away from the child. The stew never touched Clara. But Rosalie's bare hand struck the scorching metal. The burn was immediate. Pain flashed across her face. Clara burst into tears. Alistair crossed the room before anyone else could react. That evening, after the household settled, Rosalie sat alone while cool cloths eased the injury. A knock sounded at the door. She looked up. The Duke entered carrying fresh bandages. Without a word he sat beside her. His hands were steady as he carefully wrapped the burn. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence felt strangely intimate. When his fingers brushed hers, Rosalie forgot to breathe. When she looked up, she found him watching her. Not as a servant. Not as an employee. As a woman. Something unspoken passed between them. Something neither dared name. Then footsteps echoed outside the corridor. The moment broke. Yet as Alistair rose to leave, his gaze lingered on her face longer than it should have. And for the first time since arriving at Ravenshire Manor, Rosalie realized the greatest danger awaiting her inside this castle might not be loneliness at all. Christmas arrived beneath a sky of brilliant silver. Fresh snow blanketed the countryside surrounding Ravenshire Manor, transforming fields and forests into a world that seemed painted from a fairy tale. The children had been counting the days until the annual Christmas market in the nearby town, and for once their excitement overcame every lingering shadow from the past. Rosalie watched Clara press her face against the carriage window as they traveled along the snowy road. "I want ribbons," Clara announced. "You said that yesterday," Henry replied. "I still want ribbons." Edward rolled his eyes. "You also wanted a pony yesterday." "I still want that too." Rosalie laughed. The sound drew smiles from both boys. Moments like these had become common over recent months. The children who once hid from the world now spoke freely. The kitchen had become the center of their lives, and somehow the warmth created there seemed to follow them everywhere. Only one person remained behind. Duke Alistair Ravenshire. Estate business had delayed his departure, and he promised to join them before evening. Clara complained for nearly half the journey. Rosalie secretly agreed with her. The town bustled with holiday celebrations. Music drifted through crowded streets. Merchants sold roasted chestnuts and sweet pastries. Children darted between decorated stalls carrying wooden toys and bright ribbons. For several wonderful hours, the Ravenshire children looked like ordinary children. Not abandoned heirs. Not objects of gossip. Simply children. Rosalie treasured every second. Then the weather changed. The first warning came from the wind. A sudden icy gust swept through the market square, scattering snow across cobblestones. Merchants glanced toward the darkening horizon. Within minutes gray clouds swallowed the sun. The cheerful atmosphere began dissolving into nervous urgency. Shopkeepers started closing their stalls. Families hurried toward shelter. Snow began falling heavily. Rosalie's stomach tightened. The journey home suddenly seemed far less simple. They departed immediately. 2 servants accompanied the children while the carriage attempted to navigate worsening conditions. Visibility vanished with alarming speed. The road disappeared beneath drifting snow. Trees became dark shapes hidden behind swirling white curtains. The horses struggled against fierce winds. Soon progress slowed to a crawl. When the carriage could go no farther, everyone continued on foot toward a nearby hunting lodge known to exist several miles away. The storm intensified. Snow lashed their faces. The air itself felt sharp enough to cut skin. Rosalie kept Clara wrapped inside her coat while Edward and Henry walked beside the servants. No one spoke much. The blizzard swallowed every sound. Then disaster struck. It happened near a frozen river. The ice stretched across the water like solid ground. Snow concealed its weaknesses. Henry moved slightly ahead of the group. Only a few steps. Just enough. The crack echoed through the storm. A terrible sound. Sure. Sudden. Wrong. Henry froze. The ice shattered beneath him. The boy vanished instantly. One moment he existed. The next he was gone. The river exploded upward around the hole. Edward screamed his brother's name. Clara began crying. The servants rushed forward and stopped abruptly. The ice continued cracking. Nobody knew where it would break next. Nobody knew how to reach him. Henry surfaced briefly. His terrified face appeared above black water. Then the current dragged him lower. Rosalie did not think. She moved. Before fear could stop her. Before reason could interfere. She threw off her heavy cloak and ran. The cold struck like a hammer the moment she plunged into the river. Every breath disappeared. Every muscle screamed. The freezing water wrapped around her body like chains. Still she swam. Henry surfaced again. Barely. Rosalie reached him. His fingers clung desperately to her shoulders. The current fought both of them. The ice groaned overhead. She pushed him toward the nearest solid edge. A servant crawled forward and grabbed the boy. Edward helped pull his brother to safety. For one beautiful moment, Rosalie thought the danger had passed. Then the river shifted. A powerful current seized her legs. She slammed against the underside of the ice. Pain burst through her skull. Darkness and white frost surrounded her. She searched desperately for the opening. It was gone. Only endless frozen glass remained above her. Panic erupted. Her lungs burned. She struck the ice repeatedly. Nothing happened. The world narrowed. The current dragged her farther beneath the frozen river. Above the surface, Edward realized she had not emerged. The horror on his face silenced everyone. Rosalie had saved Henry. Now she was disappearing. At that exact moment another figure appeared through the storm. Alistair. He had been racing toward town after hearing warnings about the blizzard. The moment he saw the chaos beside the river, he understood enough. One glance at Henry. One glance at the broken ice. One glance at Edward's devastated expression. Then he saw Rosalie beneath the surface. For the first time in years, genuine terror entered his heart. Not fear for himself. Fear of losing her. He charged forward. The ice cracked beneath his weight. He ignored it. A servant tried stopping him. He shoved past. Rosalie's faint silhouette drifted deeper beneath the frozen river. Alistair grabbed a fallen branch and smashed it against the ice. Once. Twice. Again. The frozen surface shattered. He plunged into the water. The cold was unbearable. He never felt it. His entire world contained only one objective. Reach her. The current fought him viciously. Still he swam. Finally his hand found hers. Rosalie was unconscious. Her body floated limply beneath the water. Alistair pulled her toward the opening. Every movement demanded impossible strength. Yet somehow he reached the surface. Together they emerged into the storm. He carried her through blinding snow while servants followed with the children. The hunting lodge became a beacon in the darkness. Hours passed. A physician was summoned. Blankets surrounded Rosalie. Fires roared. Nothing seemed enough. She remained unconscious. Night deepened. The children eventually slept from exhaustion. Only Alistair remained awake. He sat beside her bed without moving, without eating, without resting. Every few minutes he reached for her wrist, checking, waiting, praying. The possibility of losing her hollowed him from within. Near dawn, Rosalie finally stirred. Her eyelids fluttered. A weak breath escaped her lips. Alistair rose instantly. Relief crashed through him so powerfully it nearly brought him to his knees. Her eyes opened slowly. Confusion lingered there. then recognition. For several seconds neither spoke. The room felt impossibly quiet. Finally Alistair exhaled. "You foolish woman." His voice cracked. The words carried far more pain than anger. Rosalie stared at him. He looked exhausted, terrified. "Human. You could have left us." Silence followed. Neither moved. Neither breathed. Because they had both heard it. Not them. Not the children. And judging by the look that suddenly appeared in Alistair Ravenshire's eyes, he had only just realized it himself. Winter slowly loosened its grip on England, but happiness remained firmly rooted inside Ravenshire Manor. The children laughed more than they had in years. Clara no longer cried herself to sleep. Henry's quiet sadness had begun giving way to confidence. Even Edward, who had once carried the weight of protecting everyone around him, occasionally allowed himself to smile without restraint. At the center of every change stood Rosalie Hartwell. The kitchen remained the heart of the estate. Morning sunlight spilled across flower-covered tables. Fresh bread filled corridors with warmth. Servants smiled more often. Life seemed to be returning to a house that had nearly forgotten how to live. For a brief time, it felt as though the wounds of the past were finally healing. Then the past returned. The carriage arrived just before noon. No one expected it. No one recognized the crest immediately. The vehicle rolled through the gates with none of the elegance usually associated with noble visitors. Mud covered the wheels. The paint had faded. Even the horses looked exhausted. Rosalie happened to be standing near a window when it stopped before the manor entrance. A woman emerged. Beautiful. Elegant. Familiar. The color drained from the head housekeeper's face. One servant dropped an entire tray. Another whispered a prayer. Rosalie knew instantly. Lady Vivienne Ravenshire had come home. News spread through the castle faster than fire. The children learned within minutes. Clara stared at the doorway as though trying to remember a dream she had forgotten years ago. Henry looked frightened. Edward looked furious. Duke Alistair looked as though someone had opened an old wound and poured salt directly into it. Vivienne entered the manor wearing a carefully constructed smile. Time had not destroyed her beauty. Yet something beneath the surface had changed. The confidence that once came from endless admiration now seemed forced. The arrogance remained. The warmth did not. She greeted everyone as though 3 years had been 3 days. As though she had merely returned from a pleasant holiday. As though abandoning her children had been a minor inconvenience. The children did not run into her arms. That appeared to surprise her. Clara hid behind Rosalie. Henry refused eye contact. Edward simply stared. The silence was devastating. For the first time, Vivienne seemed to understand that absence carried consequences. Unfortunately, understanding and regret were not the same thing. The truth emerged quickly. The foreign nobleman she had abandoned her family for was gone. His fortune had disappeared. His affection had vanished even faster. He had left her with debts, humiliation, and no title worth mentioning. Now she wanted the only thing she had once thrown away. The Ravenshire name. The Ravenshire wealth. The Ravenshire position. Rosalie watched carefully. Every conversation felt calculated. Every smile seemed rehearsed. Vivienne rarely asked about the children's happiness. Instead she asked about the estate, the finances, the household, the future inheritance. Edward noticed it too. One evening he cornered Rosalie inside the kitchen. "She doesn't love us." The statement was painfully direct. Rosalie set aside the loaf she was slicing. "Edward." "No." His voice remained calm. That somehow made it worse. "She wants something." Rosalie could not deny it. The boy had inherited his father's intelligence. He saw far more than adults realized. Meanwhile society embraced Vivienne's return with predictable enthusiasm. The scandalous Duchess had come home. London adored the story. Invitations arrived immediately. People who had mocked Alistair suddenly welcomed him again. The same aristocrats who once pitted the abandoned family now celebrated reconciliation. Their hypocrisy disgusted Rosalie. The worst moment came during a royal gathering several weeks later. Alistair attended reluctantly. Rosalie accompanied the family only because Clara begged her not to stay behind. The ballroom glittered beneath hundreds of candles. Music drifted through golden halls. Every noble family in attendance seemed fascinated by the unfolding drama. Vivienne understood exactly how much attention she possessed. She enjoyed every second. Near the middle of the evening she approached Rosalie in front of dozens of guests. The conversation began pleasantly enough. Then Vivienne smiled. The expression contained no kindness whatsoever. "You have certainly become comfortable here." Several nearby aristocrats turned to listen. Rosalie remained composed. "I care deeply for the children." Vivienne laughed softly. "How quickly servants forget themselves." The surrounding guests smiled. No one intervened. No one objected. Vivienne stepped closer. "You are only a cook." The words landed like a slap. "Know your place." Laughter followed. Not loud laughter. The restrained amusement of people who believed cruelty became sophistication when delivered politely. Rosalie felt every gaze in the room settle upon her. The humiliation burned. She excused herself before anyone could witness the tears gathering in her eyes. Outside, cold night air greeted her. She stood alone beneath the stars trying to steady her breathing. For months she had allowed herself to believe she belonged. For months she had forgotten society's rules. Vivienne had reminded her in a single sentence. A cook remained a cook. A duke remained a duke. Some distances could never be crossed. The ride home passed in silence. Rosalie withdrew further with each passing day. The children noticed immediately. So did Alistair. Neither knew how to stop it. Then came the night that shattered whatever strength she still possessed. Clara appeared in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. The little girl climbed into Rosalie's lap without asking permission. Rosalie wrapped her arms around her automatically. For several minutes neither spoke. The fire crackled softly nearby. Finally Clara whispered, "If Mama came back." Rosalie already knew where the question was heading. Pain tightened inside her chest. The child looked up with frightened eyes. "Does that mean you have to leave?" Rosalie opened her mouth. No words emerged. Because she did not know. Because perhaps she should leave. Because loving this family had become dangerous. Clara waited for an answer that never came. Eventually exhaustion overtook her. The little girl fell asleep with tears still damp upon her cheeks. Rosalie remained beside the fire long after midnight holding the child. And when she finally carried Clara upstairs, she discovered a sealed legal envelope waiting outside the Duke's study. The moment Alistair opened it the following morning, every trace of color vanished from his face. Lady Vivienne Ravenshire was demanding custody of her children. The custody petition exploded across England like a firestorm. Every newspaper carried the story. The scandalous Duchess returns. The battle for the Ravenshire heirs. Would a mother lose her children? Society immediately chose its side. Not because it knew the truth. Because it preferred appearances. To the outside world, Lady Vivienne Ravenshire remained the children's mother. She possessed beauty, title, and charm when she chose to use them. Rosalie Hartwell was merely a cook. The facts mattered less than the image. Inside Ravenshire Manor, fear settled over every room. Clara refused to let Rosalie out of her sight. Henry grew quiet again. Edward became angrier with each passing day. Only Alistair remained calm on the surface. Beneath that calm, however, lived a fury unlike anything Rosalie had ever witnessed. One evening she found him alone in his study staring at the legal documents. The fire crackled softly beside him. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. For several moments neither spoke. Then Alistair finally broke the silence. "I survived society's laughter." His voice was low. "I survived humiliation." He stared at the papers. "But if they take my children?" The sentence remained unfinished. It did not need completion. Rosalie understood. The possibility terrified him. Not because he doubted his love. Because laws often favored blood over devotion. That night Rosalie made her decision. She would leave. Not immediately. Not before the hearing. But afterward. No matter the outcome. She loved the children too much to become another source of scandal in their lives. The realization broke her heart. The hearing arrived 3 weeks later. The courthouse overflowed before sunrise. Reporters crowded the entrance. Aristocrats filled every available seat. Even people with no connection to the family arrived hoping to witness the drama. Vivienne entered dressed in elegant mourning colors despite nobody having died. The choice was deliberate. She wished to appear tragic. Wronged. Abandoned. Rosalie arrived quietly beside the children. The moment Clara saw the courtroom, she reached for her hand. Rosalie held it tightly. The proceedings began. Vivienne's lawyer painted a beautiful picture. A mother who had made mistakes. A woman seeking redemption. A parent longing to reunite with her children. Several people in the gallery nodded sympathetically. Rosalie felt ill. Because none of it was true. Then came Alistair's testimony. The Duke remained composed. Dignified. Honest. He never insulted Vivienne. Never raised his voice. Never sought revenge. He simply described 3 years of absence. 3 years of unanswered letters. 3 years of forgotten birthdays. 3 years of children waiting beside windows for someone who never came. Silence followed his words. Yet still the courtroom seemed uncertain. Vivienne sensed it. Confidence returned. She believed she was winning. Then everything changed. The judge asked a simple question. If granted custody, Lady Ravenshire, how do you intend to provide for the children's future? Vivienne smiled. A careless smile. A victorious smile. The kind worn by people who believe they have already succeeded. That confidence became her downfall. She began speaking freely. Too freely. She mentioned estate revenues, trust funds, future inheritances, property holdings, investment accounts. The judge frowned. The lawyer beside her shifted uneasily. Still she continued. She spoke about wealth far more than children, about titles far more than family. Then she made the fatal mistake. If custody is granted, naturally their inheritance will once again be under proper maternal guidance. The courtroom fell silent. Every word suddenly sounded different. Every motive became visible. The judge leaned forward. Are you saying your primary concern is financial control? Vivienne hesitated. For the first time, genuine panic flashed across her face. She attempted to correct herself. The damage was already done. Questions followed. Then more questions. Each answer exposed another contradiction. Another selfish motive. Another lie. The elegant mask she had spent months constructing collapsed completely. By the time the testimony ended, the courtroom no longer saw a devoted mother. It saw an opportunist. A woman interested in wealth rather than children. A woman who had returned only after losing everything else. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. Even the reporters stopped smiling. Yet the most powerful moment was still waiting. The judge turned toward the children. You are not required to speak. Edward rose anyway. The 13-year-old stood with his shoulders straight. His voice trembled only once. Then not at all. The room watched in silence. Many expected childish emotion. What they received was truth. I remember the day my mother left. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Edward continued. I remember Clara crying. I remember Henry waiting for letters that never came. His gaze found Vivienne briefly. There was sadness there. Not hatred. That made it far more powerful. You gave birth to us. The words echoed through the chamber. But you did not raise us. Tears appeared in Clara's eyes. Henry stared at the floor. Edward looked toward Rosalie. Then back to the judge. A mother is not the woman who gives birth. The silence deepened. A mother is the woman who stays. His voice grew stronger. And ours stayed. Several people openly wiped tears from their eyes. Even the judge looked affected. Edward slowly sat down. The hearing ended shortly afterward. The ruling arrived before sunset. Vivienne's petition was denied. The children would remain with their father. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Clara burst into tears of relief. Henry hugged Edward. Alistair closed his eyes briefly as though releasing years of tension. Rosalie smiled through her own tears. The family had won. Which meant it was finally time for her to leave. That evening she packed quietly. No dramatic farewell. No explanation. She believed it would hurt less that way. The carriage waited outside the manor gates before dawn. The sky glowed pale gold along the horizon. Rosalie climbed inside. For several moments she simply sat there, trying to gather enough courage to leave the people she loved. Then shouting erupted behind her. The carriage stopped. She looked through the window. A crowd was gathering. Servants, villagers, reporters who still lingered after the hearing. And running through them came 3 children. Clara reached the carriage first. Rosalie stepped down immediately. The little girl threw herself into her arms. Don't go. The plea shattered what remained of Rosalie's resolve. Before she could answer, another figure emerged from the crowd. Alistair. His expression held absolute certainty. He walked directly toward her. Then, before hundreds of stunned witnesses, he dropped to one knee in the muddy street. Gasps echoed everywhere. Nobody expected a duke to kneel there. Not in a palace. Not in a ballroom. Not before servants and strangers. Yet he remained exactly where he was, looking only at her. 3 years ago my children lost a mother. Emotion thickened his voice. I lost hope. Clara tightened her grip around Rosalie's hand. Henry and Edward stood beside their father. Alistair continued. Then a cook walked into my kitchen. His eyes never left hers. She taught my children how to laugh. She taught this house how to live. And she saved all of us. Tears blurred Rosalie's vision. The entire world seemed to disappear. There was only him. Only this moment. Only the family standing before her. Rosalie Hartwell. His voice softened. Will you allow us to be your family forever? A sob escaped Clara. Henry smiled through tears. Edward looked hopeful for the first time in years. Rosalie understood then. Families were not created by blood alone. They were built through loyalty, through sacrifice, through choosing one another every day. With trembling hands she nodded. Yes. The children cheered. The crowd erupted. Alistair rose and pulled her into his arms. 1 year later, the kitchen remained exactly as it had been. Not because Duchess Rosalie Ravenshire still worked there. Because she refused to let anyone change it. The flower-covered table remained. The old stove remained. The warmth remained. It was where their family had begun. Above the fireplace hung a large painting. Rosalie holding Clara while stirring soup. Edward kneading dough. Henry rolling bread. And Alistair standing quietly in the doorway watching them. The exact moment everything changed. The exact moment love returned to Ravenshire Manor. The Duke had ordered a cook for his lonely heirs. Instead, fate had sent them a mother.